Have it. Call the member for Perdiccas.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to contribute to the debate on the Appropriation Parliament Bill 2018. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Treasurer stood up this week and demonstrated what we have all come to expect from a Labor government: spend, 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 and worry about paying it back at some time in the future. Queenslanders should be worried that this government has moved beyond their election commitments to a point where this state is facing unprecedented levels of debt. Debt is forecast to rise from $69.5 billion in 2017-18 to a whopping $83.1 billion in 2021-22, and that should be ringing alarm bells for all Queenslanders, because the cold hard fact is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that Queensland is drowning in this debt. When you couple that with an unemployment rate of 6.25%, you would have to say that the future is not all that rosy for this state. As the Director of Queensland Economic Advocacy Solutions said in his analysis of the budget, we are stealing from our children and their children. It is our future generations who will be saddled with servicing this debt, and whilst the Treasurer and this government might be happy to live in the here and now, I have grave concerns about the ability of this great state to bounce back from this crippling debt. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a budget highlighted by 5 new taxes that will raise a staggering $2.2 billion. And if that isn't bad enough, there are 4 new fees that have come out of nowhere and been lumped on Queenslanders. There is no sugarcoating what this is. Why should the people of North Queensland have to contribute to the waste levy for an issue which exists in the southeast corner of the state? The problem exists because New South Wales is dumping their rubbish at Ipswich, not Townsville or Cairns, so why are we paying? Put simply, this government has broken an election promise to the people of Queensland, and between now and the next election, I will be taking every available opportunity to remind people of that fact. Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to start by looking at my shadow portfolios of natural resources and mines and North Queensland. I note that the Coal Mine Workers Health Scheme will receive $17 million over 2 years to take action to ensure the regulatory framework for safety and health in the resources sector is contemporary and effective. The health of our mine workers is paramount, and I have plenty of them in my electorate. I know this government has been slow to act on the recommendations contained within the Black Lung report. However, this is an important issue for my electorate, and one that needs to be implemented immediately and monitored closely. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a government that doesn't like to talk about mining, coal or gas, particularly in the southeast corner of the state, but let's look at what the resource sector contributed to the state coffers. Almost $4 billion in 2017-18, about $500 million more than estimated in the mid-year review, and $1 billion more than predicted in last year's budget was collected by the state government in coal royalties alone. This Labor government was elected on a platform of only mentioning mining twice in the entire election policy commitments. Yet the irony is that it is those exact resource industries that have provided the government with the cash it needs to pursue its pet projects rather than reinvest in these profit and job-creating industries. Mr Deputy Speaker, make no mistake, Labor actively undermines and secretly opposes the mining and resources sector to secure Greens' preferences in inner-city Brisbane seats like the Treasurer's. And yet, as the QRC Chief Executive Ian Macfarlane said this week, every Queenslander, regardless of where they call home, shares in the wealth of the sector through royalties paid to the government. These royalties go to schools, hospitals and roads in the southeast of Queensland. We should not forget that, and the LNP is proud to support and stand shoulder to shoulder with our miners in recognition of the contribution they make to this state. Coal is definitely not a dirty word on this side of the House, and will continue to play an integral part in the future of this state for many years to come. Mr Deputy Speaker, if I could turn to the Gas Action Plan, a plan that was promised 2 years ago and still has not been delivered. I noted in the budget that $4.4 million has been allocated over 3 years to promote the development of the gas sector and bring supply to market through that Gas Action Plan. Well, my question to the Minister is, how much longer do we have to wait? I say get on with the job, deliver the plan that will give certainty to gas producers and consumers throughout the state, because like coal, you're quick to put your hand out for the royalties, but not so quick to put the money back into the sector to support its growth. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Premier is quick to point out that the government's record public service employment figures, and yet when it comes to the Department of Natural Resources and Mines, it shows they have a reduction of 11 employees across the department. The Treasurer stood in this place on Tuesday and trumpeted the resource sector and the increased royalties that have flowed into the government coffers from the state's coal mines, and yet when it comes to supporting the department that has responsibility for our mines, they have actually cut positions. So I guess that highlights for me the lack of clout that this minister has around the cabinet table. Mr Deputy Speaker, on the subject of royalties, I want to say this. I now have the greater percentage of coal mines in this state located in my electorate. As a consequence, most of that $3.7 billion in royalties that have flowed into Treasury have come from my electorate. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, is it unreasonable for me to expect this government to acknowledge the contribution my electorate is making to the state's economy and fund the critical infrastructure and projects that we so desperately need? Projects like roads, bridges, dams, the Bowen Marina, Air Industrial Estate, new police stations at Clermont and Nebo, to name a few. I cannot speak strongly enough on the importance to my rural towns of maintaining and growing the population of these communities. I note in the budget strong and sustainable resources additional funding of $2.5 million over 2 years to implement and administer the requirements of the Strong and Sustainable Resource Communities Act of 2017. The object of this Act is to implement a Locals First program, legislating against the use of 100% FIFO workforce for the operation of mines located near a regional community. Many of my towns, such as Glendon, Nebo, Clermont and Middlemount, are struggling to maintain services and deliver programs because of population decline. And I certainly hope the funding identified in the budget is put to good use in attracting and retaining workers in our rural and regional communities and not swallowed up by bureaucratic red tape. This money needs to flow through to the coalface in support of local jobs and training, with a view to attracting workers and their families back to the bush. Mr Deputy Speaker, if I could move on to water, and can I start by asking the Minister, where is the new office of Sunwater going to be located? I note $6.23 million has been allocated to relocate the office, and I certainly hope it is going to be relocated to the regions, where it makes practical sense given the importance of irrigation water to these areas. I do. Mr Deputy Speaker, this Labor government has been dragged kicking and screaming to the table to provide funding for the construction of Rookwood Weir. And while it is encouraging to see that the state government has finally committed to matching the LNP federal government's $176 million for Rookwood Weir, that's where it stops. There is no other funding in the budget for dams, and doesn't that highlight the fundamental difference between those opposite and the LNP who have committed to building the dams throughout Queensland that we need for water security and economic prosperity? Labor doesn't have a plan for water security, unlike the LNP, who have already committed to delivering the necessary water infrastructure to our state. More dams means more jobs, greater job security and reliable water supplies for decades to come. This Labor government doesn't understand how critical investment in water infrastructure is for the future of this state. The budget does not allocate the required funding for upgrades and construction of dams that will grow regional Queensland. Unbelievably, the federal government has three...
Excuse me, member, could I ask that you adjourn the debate, please?